This video is going to discuss typography, which is our text on our websites. I'm back under the class discussions tab on Blackboard, and I'm looking at these last three files today. Sorry, they're not all files, this one is a link, but these last three items I'm looking at. So let's go ahead and open up the first one. This is just a PDF that summarizes some of what we've seen in Chapter 3. Now, the book doesn't discuss as much as could have discussed about typography, because this is actually a really important topic, although there are entire books about writing for the web and entire classes you could take just on how we should compose text and how it should be displayed on websites. So I'm sure they were just trying to give a quick overview of the topic. In general, we should think about being concise. We don't want to use excessively long sentences. We want to keep things brief. We want to use lists when possible. It just makes it easier to read, and most people do not like to read a lot of content online. It's actually why in the beginning of the course, and I tell you that we have the online textbooks, but some people actually don't want that. They'd rather have the physical book because they're not comfortable with reading all that text online or switching between screens. And so we should think about that when people are on our websites as well. They want to find the information quickly, and they don't want to be overwhelmed with just the sheer amount of content. We also should think about organizing our content in almost like an outline hierarchy, where we have headings before changes in topic. We have 6 different levels of headings, which we'll see in Dreamweaver, but they allow us to add organization to our document, to create sort of this outlined effect, even though it doesn't necessarily visually appear that way, but it also increases the accessibility of the page. It allows somebody that is using a screen reader to be able to jump between headings. An example of this is actually our syllabus is written with these heading levels 1 through 6, and it would allow somebody with a screen reader to see one portion and decide that they don't want to read another and jump down to the next heading. I decided to actually open it up so you could see a little bit of a visual indicator of what I'm talking about, since we don't have the board or any of that in the on the videos. This was formatted with a title, and these are all formatted with headings. And this allows somebody to say, oh, course description, I don't need to read that. Let me jump down to materials. Even though for those of us that have the ability to see the visual information, it's easy to scan through it. It's certainly much easier to scan through with these heading levels, and this would have probably been a heading 3. So it's a little bit less dumb because it's under materials. This would be a higher level heading than the subheadings of textbooks, supplies, and computers, software that are under materials. This happens in the back end, but one of the benefits to using these heading levels when we get into actually creating our website is that if somebody was using a screen reader, they don't have to read through all this text when they already know that they have, access to a computer or the supplies. They can just jump to the headings, so it significantly increases accessibility. I only mention this now, even though we're not using the web authoring software yet, so that when you're composing text, you start to think about being able to chunk things into subject matters with headings. When we think about our typography, sorry, there's a typo on the handout here. There should be TYPO. Anyway, when we think about our typography, we think about one of 2 items, either readability or legibility. Now I'm just looking at this page, and it just occurred to me, this document is also on the back end formatted with headings as well. And this is a heading 1, this is a heading 2. Readability and legibility, if you see they're a little bit smaller, they're actually heading 3s. Anyway, so a little bit off topic there, but when we think about our typography, we think about it either in terms of readability or legibility. Readability is the term that applies to having large chunks of text, like whole paragraphs. When we're thinking about large chunks of text, we tend to prefer serif fonts. Serif fonts have little serifs on the letters. These are all, you can see them on the S down here and up here, or the E here. I posted this is actually an image, this thing here is an image that a graphic designer made. I think it helps you remember what the serif font is to see the little humorous item here. These serifs, these little lines, they create almost an underlined effect to the words without the bulky distraction of an underline, and they help to keep us on the same line. Many of you have probably read a novel before and been reading, and all of a sudden you're 3 lines above or 1 line below where you should be. You just can't keep your eyes on the right line. Serif fonts help to compensate for that. So you would use a serif font if you're using large blocks of text, or you anticipate somebody printing, meaning it for print. We should think about font sizes that don't get smaller than 8 point or larger than 18 point. In this document, I can zoom in a little bit, but I've actually placed them in those fonts. Placed this in the serif fonts so we could get a visual idea of what we're talking about. Font weight are bold and italicus. We should avoid all of this unnecessary formatting. Things like bold, italicus, capitalization, script. We should only use that when it's absolutely necessary. We shouldn't have a lot of that excessive formatting going on through the page. We should think about the length of our lines. Keep them short, but as this is not too short, we want people to be able to read the text. But imagine that I had a paragraph where I was reading all the way from here and ending the line all the way in this top right corner. That would be really frustrating. It would be a lot easier to read a paragraph that starts here and ends here. I'm more likely to get off of my line or just get frustrated by the time I get to the end of this. So if we keep our lines to about 50 to 75 characters, just a little bit easier to read. Another concept is the idea of contrast, which means that we have a significant difference between the text and the background. White text on a black background is actually our highest contrast situation. When you've picked out a color scheme for your website, you could use something like this page to see if there is enough contrast between the colors that you've chosen. This, by the way, was linked to under our publisher's textbook, Chapter 3, Text Considerations. I'm looking at this contrast checker. Although sometimes this is just visually apparent. When we were looking at those web pages in our last video with the light gray text on the white background, it's just visually apparent that it could be difficult to read. That's something that we should keep in mind, having a large differentiation between the background and the text. So readability is when our typography applies to having large areas of text, paragraphs or other large chunks of text. Our next area is legibility. Legibility applies to short bursts of text, and by that I mean something like a title or heading. When we are concerned with short bursts of text, we typically think about sans serif fonts because sans serif fonts are cleaner. And typically headings, titles, short bursts of text are typically larger on the page. And those serifs, as much as they help us stay on the line, they also can create spacing issues. For instance, I've got a little bit of a spacing issue with the H here because that serif has added a little bit more space in between these two characters than the O and the T, where I don't have a serif actually extending as I did with the H. Or the I. We can see the serif extending and we're creating more space around the I and F, between these two, because of the serif on the I as well as the F, than we do on ones where that doesn't extend, the O and the T. When things get larger, these spacing issues become more apparent. When we're talking about small text, a minuscule spacing issue that just becomes, two minuscules of space isn't that noticeable. But with a lot of text, it does become noticeable. And then we should realize that all caps are hard for people to read. It's just harder to read without that rise and fall of text. So we want to kind of reserve that. A lot of people have the tendency to just put headings in all capital letters to attract attention to them. There might be other ways that we can attract attention to that other than decreasing the readability. So this is another image from our textbook, just illustrating the idea of serif fonts, things like Times New Roman or Georgia, and Arial fonts would be things like, sans serif fonts, would be things like Arial, is an example of a sans serif font. This is the last area we're going to look at, some considerations for putting our page together. One thing we might want to think about are whether or not our text should be typed in the content of the page, or we should use text in an image. For instance, when you did the Lab 2 and you put text inside the image. The benefit to putting text inside the graphic is that we have complete control over how it appears. The downside is accessibility. Another downside would be if there's a typographical error, we have a large problem. Having a typo in a graphic likely means, if I'm building a website in a corporate sense, then I now have to go back to the graphic designer to get that fixed, which is, presumably an expensive process. It's going to delay things. So a typo or a future need to edit. I don't want to put text in a graphic where that text is always changing. For instance, maybe it says the date. We don't want to use that and have to keep changing between, February 5th, 2014 and February 6th, 2014. But we do get that appearance benefit to it. If we were to put text in a graphic, we have that consistency of appearance. So that's something we might to consider while we're looking at our page. The most common use of text in graphics is buttons, putting buttons for navigation on the page. The next area here, support for font choice. If we go back to our textbook's website and we see a link here for our common fonts, we see a list of fonts that are common or standard to Windows, Mac, and so sometimes they call them browser safe fonts, but they are essentially, sorry, I should have scrolled down earlier. They're essentially fonts where we don't need to worry about whether or not they're going to be supported. One of the things you might choose is to put in multiple choices of font in case the first one's not available. But this just gives you an idea. It's not that you couldn't use the other font. It's just to be aware of what the compatibility issues might be with the font that you've chosen, especially if your font is really integral to your design. So you can look at that as you start to move to phase 2. When I see font that's underlined, I think it's a link. I think I should be able to click on this and go somewhere. So underlining is not a good way to emphasize text. Underlines should be reserved for links. Even if I haven't underlined my links, maybe I have a web page where instead of underlining my links, I change their color. I still should not use underlining for my text somewhere else for emphasis, because people are going to think that they can still click on it and be taken somewhere. And when they're not taken there, they're going to get frustrated. The logical and physical styles is coming up again. We saw this, a little bit in the, I think it was the first video, letting the browser decide how it's going to interpret is a logical style. And a physical style says, I specifically want this. Another term for this, the term that the design considerations handout used, is logical as relative and physical as absolute. Got another typo in here. Sorry about this. This should be type, T-Y-P-E. Proportional is text where each letter takes up space in proportion to its width. So the I doesn't take up as much space as a big round letter like the O or P or even a W. Monospaced fonts are when every letter has the same amount of space. For instance, imagine an airplane where everybody has the same size seat, regardless of whether or not they are very young and short and small or large. They have the same amount of space for the letters. When you're designing your website, in the beginning, you might want to consider using something like this lorem ipsum text. This link, if you're curious, it was under class discussions, lorem ipsum. When you move to phase 2, we are going to actually put text on our page so that we can see how the typography fits with the design. In phase 1, you could have put text there, or you could have just said my text will be here. But in phase 2, we are actually going to be putting text on our page. Well, we might not want to get burdened by writing the text right now, because we could be doing that in phase 3. And now phase 2 is really focused on narrowing in the design of your page. Lorem ipsum is a text generator. It's just dummy text that follows the rise and fall of our natural language, and then it's easier to read. It doesn't attract attention or distract you from the design. So I could say that I want to generate, let's say, 2 paragraphs of text. And I could generate this and actually use this area. I would select this and copy it into my website. Oops. I could select this and use this in my site design instead of the actual text. And then I get an idea for where the text would fit, how the final page would look, without having to spend a half an hour actually writing the text. This is an example of a page layout similar to what we're going to be doing in phase 2. And on the phase 1 due date, we'll actually be talking about moving to phase 2 in more detail. But you'll be putting a background and color to your page, looking at the banner, the logo itself, and making a visual diagram out of what was your prior black and white wireframe. And I pulled this up because this is not what we want to do with regards to the typography. If you look at the page, it's all these home links. I'm so distracted by the fact that the word home is repeated that I can't really think about the design of the page. I'm so distracted by sample text being repeated. In fact, your eye is just sort of drawn to that you can't really think about whether or not that was the right font choice or size or anything, because we're just so distracted by that. And that's why we use the lorem ipsum text. The text doesn't actually say anything that we could use, but it follows the same rise and fall of our natural language, so we don't get sucked in and distracted by something like this, where the sample text area just dominates the page. So the link to that is here. And the last thing that we will look at in the video is just to recap where all of our materials are for the typography section. The handout, the PDF handout, is here. That graphic displaying the sans serif and serif fonts and the lorem ipsum text generator. If we go to our textbooks page, we can see these common fonts. I thought I had bookmarked those as well, but anyway, and then we could look at contrast. You don't necessarily need to do this or this. You know, just wanted to let you know that that was there, because some of this is actually little, well, it depends on what you actually have on your project. If you're going to go into those, you know, need to access those specific resources. So on that note, we're going to end the video. That was pretty much the end of our discussion on typography.